It's our pleasure tonight to have Dr. Gleb Trispersky, the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts. He's a well-known author, and he's here to share his innovative ideas on risk management. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Gleb.
Thank you very much. And I'm glad that you all attended. So we'll talk about how you as IT professionals can make the best decisions using neuroscience and behavioral economics, which are my areas of expertise. So that's kind of the balance we'll talk about. The first part of the presentation, we'll talk about the mistakes that everyone, including IT professionals, tends to make because of how our brain is wired. The neuroscience of the mistakes we make, and there are plenty of mistakes that we make. We'll go through in depth into why we make those mistakes, and we'll give a couple of examples of these typical mistakes that we make that our mental habits cause us to make in our professional lives as well as personal lives. But of course, we'll be talking much more about our professional lives because that's what the presentation is about. So that's going to be the first part of the presentation. How can you identify them? What they are? Then the second part of the presentation will give you a couple of techniques that you can use to address these mistakes in all of your activities and help your teams address them in their activities, help your organization as a whole. So help everyone address these mistakes, these typical dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases in your activities. So that's what the presentation is about. Now, the first dangerous judgment error that I want to tell you about is called the planning fallacy. The planning fallacy, that has to do with how we make plans, how we proceed forward. When we tend to assume that the future will go according to plan. You've probably heard the phrase that failing to plan is planning to fail. Failing to plan is planning to fail. It's a pretty popular phrase. Unfortunately, it's also a very misleading one because our gut intuition, our reaction, our feeling is that when we make a plan, everything will go according to plan. And we don't plan nearly enough for risks, contingencies, problems of various sort that come up very frequently in all sorts of activities that we do, especially more major ones, more serious ones. We underestimate the resources we need of time, money, information, social capital. There was a study conducted, so of particular relevance for you as IT professionals, there was a study conducted in 2014 of major IT projects. Major IT projects, and it was looking at how many of these projects finish on budget and how many of them go over budget. Well, guess what? About 84% of all major IT projects go over budget. 84%, that means only 16% stay within budget. And of those that go over budget, on average, they go over budget by 189%. So more than twice as much, nearly 3 times their original planned budget. That would be for things like CRM installations, so major projects, website revisits, kind of doing various things in the back end. Those are all big, major issues, and they tend to fall into the planning fallacy. And it's especially important to know that what falls into the planning fallacy are the more serious decisions because we have less experience making them. So that's why major IT projects tend to be the ones that fall into the planning fallacy category, where we don't build in nearly enough time, nearly enough money, nearly enough resources to address the kind of problems that tend to come up in these projects because we feel so confident about ourselves and our plans. So that's a big problem that I see happening in IT all the time. And I'm curious for you to share whether that happens in your organization, to what extent it happens, if it does. So what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to see in the Zoom poll. Zoom has a polling feature, so if you're not familiar with it, you'll be able to see in the Zoom poll an opportunity to vote on how problematic is the planning fallacy in your organization. So if your organization has very little projects going over time or over budget, it's not a problem or a minor problem. If maybe something like 10 to 20% go over time or over budget, that's going to be a moderate problem. If it's more than 20%, it's going to be a large problem. So please vote on those percentages in your workplace. How problematic is the planning fallacy? So minor problem, moderate problem, a large problem. So please go ahead and vote. So we see that the planning fallacy is definitely a problem for the people in attendance. It's for 1 hour, so for 11% of you, it's not a problem, but for the vast majority, or 89% of you, it's either a moderate problem or a large problem. So it's important to realize that that's something that's happening, and there are ways of addressing this problem, this cognitive bias, these dangerous judgment error, which we'll talk about later. But that's something to diagnose and understand that this is just one of these dangerous judgment errors, cognitive biases, that cause us to make bad decisions. And you can take specific steps to address these cognitive biases effectively. Let's talk a little bit more about what's going on here. Why do we fall into these dangerous judgment errors? What's going on? Well, we tend to go with our gut. We tend to go with our feelings. We tend to go with what feels comfortable and intuitive to us. And there are prominent gurus who tell us to do that. Tony Robbins, who tells us to be primal, be savage, or Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote the book Blink, tells us to make your decision in the blink of an eye. Those gurus tell us to trust our intuition, go with our heart, go with your gut, whatever flavor of the be primal, be savage, blink, it all means the same thing. Trusting our gut feels very comfortable. By definition, it's intuitive. It's what we feel. It's what feels good to us, what feels right to us. But feeling of rightness doesn't necessarily at all lead to the right results. What we feel to be true is not necessarily at all true. What we feel to be right in our decision making is not necessarily at all right. That's why when we make a plan, we feel it's a good plan, but we're often going to fail to act in accordance to the plan because the world will not act in accordance to what we want it to be. And that's why we see that the large majority of you, 89%, experience some planning fallacy in your organization, and often leads to disasters. And by disaster, I mean anything that has a significant negative impact on your work. So a significant negative impact on your work, that's what a disaster is. Our gut, our intuitions, our feelings, we have to understand the reasons we make these mistakes. They're not evolved for the modern world. I mean, how the modern world has really been around since the development of computers and the internet in the 1990s. We have not evolved since that time. Many of us, I've been alive since the 1990s. Of course, we haven't evolved. It takes a very long time for evolution to work. Our gut reactions, our intuitions, they're hardwired into us. And they are hardwired from the savanna environment. When we lived in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people, we were hunters, gatherers, foragers. That's what our gut reactions are wired for. And that explains a great deal of these dangerous judgment errors called cognitive biases. That's why this bad advice going with your gut is so common. It causes us to fall into cognitive biases. Cognitive biases is the technical scientific term for these dangerous judgment errors. And I'll talk more in depth about them, and you can get resources and much more information after the presentation. But the cognitive biases that you need to be aware of, you can take a look at the list of cognitive biases in Wikipedia. There's over 100 of them. So lots of them, explore what they are. Planning fallacy is just one. We're going to be talking about the assessment in just a bit that goes through the 30 most dangerous ones for yourself, and for your organization, for your work. These are the 30 most dangerous ones in the workplace, and you'll be able to get the assessment after the presentation if you wish. And they come from a combination of our evolutionary background, as I mentioned, with the way that we evolved, and just the structure of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, the cerebellum, all of this stuff. I will not go into this in much depth, the prefrontal cortex, the neuroscience stuff. I can talk about it in the Q&A. So if you have questions, please ask me. But I'm not going to go talk about it right now in the presentation because that will take us off track a little bit. So one of the most fundamental patterns that cause us to fall into these dangerous judgment errors is called the fight or flight response. It's the way that we deal with threats. It's the way that we respond to external stimuli that we see as anxiety-inducing, anger-inducing, fear-inducing. In the savanna environment, it was very, very important for us to have a very strong fight or flight response. That saved our lives because that's the risks we faced in the moment. They were intense, immediate, like saber-toothed tigers. You might have heard of this as the saber-toothed tiger response, where you have to jump at 100 shadows to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. That was great for the savanna environment. That was excellent for the savanna environment. And in the modern world, it works really well for certain specific settings, like let's say when you have a bus barreling down at you, the proverbial bus. You don't want to wait and decide, well, maybe this bus is going to miss me by 3 inches. You don't want to do that. You don't want to move and throw yourself out of the way of the bus. That's a great response for the fight or flight response. Or when you have something flying at your head. It might be a bird, it might veer away and you don't have to worry about it. Or it might be a baseball and you'd better duck. And it's much safer to duck and not think about it. But that's not the way you want to be making decisions in the business environment. It's really dangerous in today's business world because the risks we face are much more long-term, uncertain, ambiguous. They might come as a notification on your smartphone about a disease. Okay, there's somebody who unfortunately has their sound on, so please turn off your sound if you have your sound on. Thank you very much. All right. The risks we face are much more long-term, uncertain, ambiguous. They might come from notification on your smartphone about a disease coming up in the middle of nowhere, China, right? Wuhan, China. Who knew about that city before it became famous? And when people first heard about it, it's kind of like, well, middle of nowhere, China, who cares about it? And that's not a great response because as a risk management expert, so that's my area of expertise, risk management, strategic planning, change management, that's what I do. And what I saw when I looked at what's happening in Wuhan is that it's a major metropolis. It actually has 11 million people. It produces over $22 billion of revenue per year. It has something like, it's called the Chicago of China. It's a major transportation industrial hub. It has something like 500 international flights a day before the pandemic coming in and out. And by now, that it recovered. So the pandemic is definitely going to get out of Wuhan and internationally. And that's what I was seeing when this was happening, when the public health infrastructure in Wuhan, China was collapsing. And you might not think too much about the Chinese, well, China, communist, whatever, can dismiss it. But there are some things that communists do well. They don't do consumerism well, but they do education well and they do public health well. So if you look at those social systems, those are things they do well. And for their public health infrastructure to collapse, that's a big, big red flag. So that's what I started talking, warning folks, my clients, that January and February, the pandemic is going to get out. This is not going to be something that's limited to Wuhan, China. You really need to get your ducks in a row. But people don't believe that. They feel that they don't need to worry about these things because it's not a fight or flight situation. They don't see that threat in front of them. They think they can ignore it. They think it's not a big deal. We tend to fall into what's called the normalcy bias. So the normalcy bias is one of these other cognitive biases where we tend to think that the future will be much like today. And we extend today's trend lines into the future and greatly underestimate the likelihood and the impact of major disruptors. So that's normalcy bias. That's another one that you have to understand as a cognitive bias. To overcome these dangerous judgment errors. So talk about how to overcome these dangerous judgment errors next. Oh, by the way, there are some folks who are talking in the chat. So if you want to check out the chat, you can participate in the chat and that's great. I'll get to some of the questions in the chat later in the Q&A, but just so you know that that's something you can participate in and check out people's conversation. So how can we overcome these dangerous judgment errors? You need to go against your intuitions. You need to go against your gut reactions because our intuitions were great for helping humans survive in that savanna environment. That was great, but they're not great for the modern world. And you already do that in some areas of your life. For example, in your health. Your health, let's say you're eating. So let's just talk about eating, one area of your health, your physical health relating to your diet. When you come into the break room, and let's say a grateful vendor has sent over a box of donuts for the holidays. It's very tempting to take that delicious, maybe half of a chocolate glazed donut. And once you take half a donut, it's very tempting to take the other half. I don't want to leave just a half a donut, right? well, then you get triggered by the sugar in the donuts. And then you take a second donut, and then a third donut. And then before you know it, half the box is gone. Not that it ever happened to me. So that's a very common thing for us to fall into, to be triggered by sugar. And it's understandable. In the savanna environment, it was very important for our ancestors to eat as much sugar as possible when they came across it, when they came across honey and so on. Have as much sugar as possible. Those who were strongly triggered by sugar were the ones who survived, thrived, and reproduced. We are the descendants of those who were very strongly triggered by sugar. We're the descendants of those who had a very strong fight or flight response. But in the modern world, with the overabundance of processed food, that's a very big problem for us. So instead, it's much healthier for you to skip that donut and go for a healthy bowl of fruit. That's a much healthier snack for you to have. And that's a behavior that is one way of managing your diet and having a more healthy lifestyle in the modern world. And that's a learned behavior. It's not a behavior that comes from your gut reactions. Nobody's born liking fruit. Nobody's born liking salad. Let's just be honest. Nobody's born liking salad. Babies, when you see them, they like sugar. They like to suck on sugar. That's what they see as a treat. They don't like to eat salad, fruit, whatever. Those aren't treats for them. These are learned behaviors. You have to learn to like these things, and especially you have to learn to bypass the processed sugary food for healthy treats. All right, now I'll go to another poll. Yes, Rick, you said love fruit, you're abnormal, and you likely learned to love fruit not because your mom taught you to love fruit or something like that for some reason. It's not an intuitive thing for you to love fruit. It's not a thing that babies love. So you have to look at what babies like. They don't eat fruit. So take a look at the next polling question. And it has to do with our decision-making, our intuitive decision-making. Was there ever a time when you felt that you were very confident about something and you turned out to be wrong, maybe even badly wrong? And that caused you to doubt other areas of where you might be right or wrong. So you turned out to be badly wrong. I know it happened to me once when I hired an assistant manager for my company. And I promoted her from the ranks. I thought she'd do a great job. And unfortunately, I was pretty wrong. She was a great employee, but when she went into the managerial role, she became kind of micromanaging others, and she really didn't have a good relationship with her teammates. So that was a mistake on my part to promote her. And that was definitely something that I regret and I wish I could have taken back. All right. So we see that to 1/5 of you, this is not an experience you had, but 4/5 of you, that's an experience you've definitely had, and that's something you share. So you can kind of understand where the sense where you turned out to be badly wrong, despite being confident in something. The solution to cognitive biases, you have to have awareness of these, is to have strong emotional intelligence and strong social intelligence. You need emotional intelligence to notice them within yourself and address them, and social intelligence to notice them within others and address them, because you also want to be able to influence others to not fall into these cognitive biases. Emotional intelligence, what's that? You might have heard this term. It has to do with two things: being aware of and being able to manage your own emotions. Our emotions determine the vast majority of our decision making. About 80 to 90% of our decisions come from our emotions when we just go forward and do what we feel is right. When we go forward and do what's comfortable to us, that's emotions. So being aware of and being able to manage your emotions, that is fundamentally important to address cognitive biases. Social intelligence has to do with being able to be aware of and manage other people's emotions and their relationships with each other and with you. So if you want to be able to influence other people to not fall into these cognitive biases, to address them, you need to be able to influence their emotions and their relationships. So those are two big areas of skills to develop to help address cognitive biases. And to get emotional awareness, to get awareness of what cognitive biases might be causing you problems in your organization, we'll talk about an assessment to address these dangerous judgment errors in the workplace. And again, I'll send that to you for whoever wants, whoever votes for getting resources. It's focused on the 30 most dangerous judgment errors in professional settings. And it evaluates their extent in your workplace and their impact. So how frequent are they and how impactful are they in your workplace? And provides you with the next steps for addressing them. So that's the assessment. And I'll show you the assessment and we'll go through it. So I want you to bring up the chat feature right now. What are your thoughts on team conflicts? 30%. So again, the same idea. If it's going to be 5 to 10%, not a big deal. 15 to 20, you want to start addressing it. Over 20, that's definitely a serious issue. And this is about a cognitive bias called the illusion of transparency. The illusion of transparency refers to the fact that when we communicate, we feel ourselves to be perfectly transparent and very effective at communicating our message. And that's, of course, an illusion, because in the modern world of Zoom, there can be technical glitches. People can drop in and out. They can not hear you for a second. And it's very easy to have those technical issues. So that's one thing, technical issues. That happens, of course, in-person communication too, technical issues, where someone mishears you. Maybe maybe they are distracted by something going on. Maybe there's a loud sound somewhere and they're distracted. Or maybe they're thinking about what they want to eat for dinner that evening, or an upcoming important meeting with their boss, and their attention wandered. So they don't hear what you're trying to say. And maybe they don't catch some nuance. Maybe you're saying something, with a wink and a hint and a smile, or you kind of think you're being ironic and they're not getting that you're being ironic and they think you're being literal. So they're misunderstanding your message. And then, of course, there's the additional level of them perceiving your message through their blinkers. So they will always perceive the message through their own filters. If you're giving them constructive critical feedback, they might be hearing an attack, that they're feeling attacked, even though you're trying to improve the situation. If you're telling them that, if you're giving them praise, they might be feeling kind of just that they're being praised, whereas you want to give them a compliment sandwich or something like that. There's a lot of things that people mishear because they don't fit their versions of the world. So that's the illusion of transparency. Next one, number 3. Of all significant decisions, in what percentage of cases was someone overconfident about the decisions? Again, in the last year, what percentage of cases was someone in the decision-making process, at least one member of the team, was overconfident about their decision? What are your thoughts on team conflicts? 30%. So again, the same idea. If it's going to be 5 to 10%, not a big deal. 15 to 20, you want to start addressing it. Over 20, that's definitely a serious issue. And this is about a cognitive bias called the illusion of transparency. The illusion of transparency refers to the fact that when we communicate, we feel ourselves to be perfectly transparent and very effective at communicating our message. And that's, of course, an illusion, because in the modern world of Zoom, there can be technical glitches. People can drop in and out. They can not hear you for a second. And it's very easy to have those technical issues. So that's one thing, technical issues. That happens, of course, in-person communication too, technical issues, where someone mishears you. Maybe maybe they are distracted by something going on. What are your thoughts on team conflicts? 30%. So again, the same idea. If it's going to be 5 to 10%, not a big deal. 15 to 20, you want to start addressing it. Over 20, that's definitely a serious issue. And this is about a cognitive bias called the illusion of transparency. The illusion of transparency refers to the fact that when we communicate, we feel ourselves to be perfectly transparent and very effective at communicating our message. And that's, of course, an illusion. What are your thoughts on team conflicts? 30%. So again, the same idea. If it's going to be 5 to 10%, not a big deal. 15 to 20, you want to start addressing it. Over 20, that's definitely a serious issue. And this is about a cognitive bias called the illusion of transparency. The illusion of transparency refers to the fact that when we communicate, we feel ourselves to be perfectly transparent and very effective at communicating our message. And that's, of course, an illusion, because in the modern world of Zoom, there can be technical glitches. People can drop in and out. They can not hear you for a second. And it's very easy to have those technical issues. So that's one thing, technical issues. That happens, of course, in-person communication too, technical issues, where someone mishears you. Maybe maybe they are distracted by something going on. Maybe there's a loud sound somewhere and they're distracted. Or maybe they're thinking about what they want to eat for dinner that evening, or an upcoming important meeting with their boss, and their attention wandered. So they don't hear what you're trying to say. And maybe they don't catch some nuance. Maybe you're saying something, with a wink and a hint and a smile, or you kind of think you're being ironic and they're not getting that you're being ironic and they think you're being literal. So they're misunderstanding your message. And then, of course, there's the additional level of them perceiving your message through their blinkers. So they will always perceive the message through their own filters. If you're giving them constructive critical feedback, they might be hearing an attack, that they're feeling attacked, even though you're trying to improve the situation. If you're telling them that, if you're giving them praise, they might be feeling kind of just that they're being praised, whereas you want to give them a compliment sandwich or something like that. There's a lot of things that people mishear because they don't fit their versions of the world. So that's the illusion of transparency. Next one, number 3. Of all significant decisions, in what percentage of cases was someone overconfident about the decisions? Again, in the last year, what percentage of cases was someone in the decision-making process, at least one member of the team, was overconfident about their decision? 20%, 10%. So this doesn't seem to be too much of an issue. So this refers to what's called the overconfidence bias, our tendency to be too confident about our decisions. We don't tend to gather enough information before making a decision and leap too quickly to conclusions. So 10%, that's not a big deal. I see a couple of people in the 20s. That's something you want to be looking at, but that's not, if it's kind of at the 20% level, it's a kind of a moderate issue, not the more serious issue that it becomes in the 30s and so on. Number 4. Okay, so Rick says that there's major poor business expansion mistakes at Verizon. So that sounds like that would be definitely an overconfidence issue, that you felt that there would be some major, so that seems like for Rick's company, maybe not his own work, but the broader company, that seems like a serious issue. Thank you for sharing that, Rick. Number 4, of all situations when someone in the decision-making process, and in general, they had evidence that would disprove their beliefs, that would say that their interpretation of the situation is not the right one, in what percentage of cases did they ignore the evidence, or did they misinterpret the information? When they really are a reasonable person, they should have gotten the situation. So this refers to a cognitive bias called the confirmation bias, where we tend to look for information that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't confirm our beliefs. Okay, next one. Number 5, percentage of situations when an individual or team had to deal with difficult or uncomfortable issues, but focused on trivial issues instead. This is a great example of, let's say, website development. So website development, when some people focus on how the buttons should look in the taskbar or the colors, instead of deeper issues like who should be their target audience and how should they proceed for the website. Spend much more time on the first question than on the much more important second question. Or let's say CRM installation, focusing on minor things on the CRM rather than how to actually implement it effectively, which is a much bigger issue for an organization. 5%, 5%. So Rick says low percent, Susan says 50%. Okay, so for most people, this tends to be lower in the priority, but definitely, Susan, that's something you want to be looking at and thinking about how to bring that information to your organization. Let's do one more. Number 6, when a potential or current employee was evaluated, in what percentage of situations was the evaluation too positive due to factors not relevant to their job competency, organizational fit, usually to politics or to relationships? Was someone evaluated in too positive of a manner in your workplace? So please go ahead. 30%. So this seems to be a much more serious issue than so many times. So Eric, I assume you meant to say because performance objectives are subjective. So, and this is the tendency, yes. So that's kind of a systematic institutional issue. So this refers to the halo effect. When we tend to like one person, we tend to have too positive a view of their other characteristics, regardless of whether we should or shouldn't. And this has to do with tribalism, whether we feel somebody is part of our tribe we tend to make bad decisions about them overall and have too positive an evaluation of them. So this is about the halo effect. Oh, I forgot to mention this one. This one is called bike shedding, and that's a cognitive bias where we tend to work. It was named for a project where, as part of building a nuclear plant, the project team spent way too much time working on a bike shed next to the nuclear plant and the nuclear plant itself. All right. So this gives you a flavor, and there are 24 more questions. And then there's a scoring section, which you can take to evaluate what's going on in your organization. And then after the scoring section, you can get to the next steps, which show you what can you actually do to address these cognitive biases. All right, I'll stop sharing now, and I'll stop and take some questions before we go on to the next section of having two techniques. So this one of the techniques to address cognitive biases, of course, is awareness of them. And the cognitive bias, the assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace, is what you can do. You can take it yourself, and you can have other people in your team take it as well, and then have a discussion of it together to address these cognitive biases. So this is a very effective tool to address cognitive biases by gaining awareness of them. And what I want you to do right now is to have a little poll about how helpful do you think it might be for some or all of your team to take and discuss the assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace. Not helpful, moderately helpful, or very helpful. So Roger says exercise in developing awareness cognitive biases. Yes, the assessment itself is an excellent exercise because that is where you go through these and see where they happen in your organization, but it's especially beneficial is the discussion afterward. And what I see, I facilitate these discussions. These are opportunities for people to say, oh, okay, why did you put 10% down and I put 80% down? What's going on? What do we see differently? And that helps you give a really important different perspective. So that's a very effective exercise. All right, so that's the end of the polling. So we see that everyone would find it helpful, and about just over half of you would find it moderately, just over half of you would find it moderately helpful, and just under half would find it very helpful. So if you find it very helpful or moderately helpful, the same step is the next step. You take it yourself and you see what's going on, go through it thoroughly, use the assessment, look at the next steps. If you find it very helpful, it's definitely something to quickly push out to your team and say, hey, I think this is really helpful. Let's take the time to do this together and discuss it. If you find it moderately helpful, it's something to discuss with your team, not kind of, push it out, but say, hey, this is something that I've taken. I think it's been helpful for me. May consider sharing it with you, consider taking it as part of a group. So that those would be the steps I would advocate. So Roger, I answered the question about the assessment. That's something that's a really great tool. Ed asks, with the planning fallacy, how do I know if I have planned adequately or not? Well, what you want to do is, of course, evaluate what are the likely scenarios where things might go wrong and how do you address all these problems? Have you addressed them effectively? And then learn over time whether your plans are adequate or not. Sometimes you'll build in too much of a buffer, and that's usually much less of a problem than building in too little. So you want to calibrate yourself over time. This is a skill. And addressing the planning fallacy is a skill that you develop over time. And you see how well you're doing over time and then adding appropriate buffers in so that you can calibrate yourself effectively. So Rick asks, what's my take on data-driven decisions? I mean, decisions definitely need to be data-driven, but it depends on how much data you want. So there's a bias called information bias, which is a cognitive bias where folks tend to try to have too much information before they make a decision. You want to decide on how much information you need for each decision. You don't want to get stuck in analysis paralysis. So gathering too much data can be just as bad as gathering too little data, because sometimes making a decision too late is worse than making a decision too early. So you want to decide how much information you need, data, for each decision. And sometimes there isn't that much data available, and that's okay. So then you just gather the data that's available. Then you can look at comparatives and case studies and how you protect yourself from risks without knowing the data. So that's something to really be thinking about. So Rick says delegating decisions to AI is scary to me. I hear you, Rick. What AI machine learning professionals, specialists have found when you're looking at the research on decision making by AIs is that they overwhelmingly tend to beat out humans in regular normal situations. So AI, algorithmic, there's certain issues with biases that are built in based on human learning, machine learning. So that's something that's kind of a separate issue. We can go into it separately. But generally speaking, algorithms beat out humans in the last majority of the time for regular situations. Humans beat algorithms for abnormal, unusual situations. So when you look at decision-making patterns, if you just have a lot of small regular decisions that there's very little abnormalities, you definitely want to use algorithms. So if you have decisions that are more complex, more ambiguous, you want to combine algorithms and humans to make those decisions. If your decisions tend to have a lot of abnormalities and unusual dynamics, then you want to use more humans. So it just depends on that sort of situation. All right, let's talk about a technique to make decisions that are good enough. This is a technique to make decisions that are sufficient. It's not the perfect decision. This is not about making the perfect decision. It's not about making the best choice out of 10 great choices. This is not what it's about. It's about not screwing up. These are 5 questions you want to ask about any decision that you don't want to screw up, whether deciding which technique to use for programming something, which project to launch, sometimes which CRM to use, sometimes which clients to work with, or a daily decision, the kind of decisions you might be making 5 to 10 times a day. Let's say when you're writing an email to an important stakeholder in your organization, trying to persuade them to do something that will be a hassle and annoying to them, but both you and she know that it should really be done. So 5 questions to avoid decision disasters. First, what important information didn't I yet fully consider? So what evidence didn't I take into account? So there are 2 components here. Important information. We talked about analysis paralysis and information bias. You don't want to fall into that. Decide what information is important in advance. So don't go looking for all the available information. For smaller decisions, you don't need as much time. This technique should take you only a couple of minutes to go through. The questions, all of them, should take you only a couple of minutes to go through for writing kind of that moderately important daily email. That's fine. For more serious questions, for more serious projects, of course, you'll take more time and there's going to be more important information. That's one component, important information. The evidence that you will not fully consider will tend to be evidence that goes against your intuitions, that goes against your gut reactions. So you want to look for that information that goes against your intuitions as part of question 1. Question 2, what dangerous judgment errors didn't I yet address? So think about those cognitive biases that we already talked about in the assessment, the planning fallacy, the normalcy bias, the overconfidence bias, the halo effect, and all of these other problems, illusion of transparency. You want to learn about these cognitive biases. And once you learn about them, you go for the assessment a couple of times, they'll become much more intuitive to you. They'll become something you bring up in your mind, and you'll be able to easily determine what kind of cognitive biases might be involved in the situation. If you're doing a task, it's going to be planning fallacy, overconfidence, bike shedding. If it's going to be communicating with other people, it's going to be illusion of transparency, halo effect, and so on. What would a trusted and objective advisor suggest I do? So think about that little angel on your shoulder, perhaps someone who's a mentor to you, or perhaps someone who is a part of AITP, who you've built a relationship with and who you trust. Who is that objective and trusted advisor, and what would they suggest you do? You get about 50% of the benefit from this question just by asking it and just by thinking out loud, okay, what would they do? And you get the other 50% of the benefit, of course, by calling this person or texting this person if you're a millennial. How have you addressed all the ways this can fail? So imagine that the decision totally and completely failed, absolutely fails. Why did it fail? What are all the reasons why it went wrong? And then how can you address them in advance? Again, for minor decisions, for those you don't want to screw up, but you don't want to take too much time, don't take too much time with this. Just give it a whirl in your mind for about 30 seconds. For more serious decisions, you'll definitely want to spend more time on this. And finally, what information would cause me to change my mind? What would cause you to revisit this decision? Would it be some more time passing? and you're gathering new information. Maybe you can launch a small project before you launch a big one. That's definitely a good technique to find out more information. There are various specific revision points you can set to change your mind and approach the decision making differently. All right, I'll take any questions that you might have on this technique. Okay, so Rick talks about good enough. Yes, good enough is very important as a technique. This is good enough, and that's where you want to orient toward. And trying new things and failing fast is also can be helpful depending on the situation, of course. And that would be part of question 5. What new information will cause me to change my mind? If you try new things, it fails. You try another thing, it fails, and that causes you to orient toward a better thing. I'm glad that those are helpful, Nilu, for the questions. Grace asks that she's a perennial optimist and oriented toward figuring out failure. I'm a perennial optimist too, so I'm very much oriented toward optimism. And what you have to learn is that as an optimist, these questions are especially helpful with number 4. How have you addressed all the ways this could fail? As part of any decision that you go through, you want to pay particular attention, Grace, to question 4. That is going to be really important for you. How have you addressed all the ways this could fail? And orient toward asking that. Milo asks, can you share some examples that you saw for these? Sure, I'll be happy to go through. Oh, hold on for a second. Susan says that how can fail can result in perception of the project manager as negative. What you want to orient toward is problem solving. You're saying don't focus on saying no, because when people talk about how can it fail, they hear it as no. When you can frame it is, if that's a problem, as how can we solve problems in advance? How can we solve issues in advance? People like problem solvers. People like those who help them solve problems, foresee and solve problems. So you can reframe that as how can you address all the ways that this could fail, but by how can we solve problems, potential problems in advance. So that's a reframing issue. That's just a communication issue so that folks don't see you as too negative. Clearly, that's a different issue than the kind of issues that Grace faces. So you want to nuance it depending on your context. So Neil asks some examples that you saw for these. Since I talked about sending an email to a colleague, what important information didn't you yet fully consider? So you can have a colleague where it might be tempting for you to ignore information that the colleague wouldn't do what you want them to do if it's a hassle, if it's stressful, and so on. Now, you can ignore that information, or you can include it in the email to address the objections in advance and say, hey, Bob, I understand it's going to be a hassle and drag for reasons X, Y, and Z, but for reasons A, B, and C, it's still going to be better for you and I and everyone else for you to do this. Second, what dangerous judgment errors didn't you yet address? So it might be planning fallacy issues, that the person will not do it in a timely manner, or they will not dedicate specific resources to it that they should dedicate. So you want to address that. A trusted and objective advisor. This is a way where you can get somebody to read your email and say, hey, is this email appropriately worded? Is there something that needs to be edited in the draft? 4, how have I addressed all the ways that this could fail? Imagine that Bob has a COVID outbreak in his area and that his kids are home from school. Previously, they were in school learning, now they're home from school, and he is upset and frustrated with the situation. So read the email as though someone is upset and frustrated, as though you're upset and frustrated. Take out any parts that might be interpreted as hostile, negative, pressury, and draw Bob's attention to the most important parts of the email, maybe deleting some of the previous text and highlighting, boldening some parts. What new information would cause me to revisit this decision? So if Bob goes into radio silence for 2 days, that can cause you to say, hey, if I don't hear from Bob within 2 days, I'm going to give Bob a call. So that can be a specific decision-making revision point for you in the email. And you saw how I ran through that very quickly. That just took me less than 2 minutes to go through that, answer all the questions. So this, for those moderate daily decisions like that, which you should be using having 5 to 10 times a day, that can take a couple of minutes for this technique. All right. You're welcome. Don't see any further questions, so let's go on to the next technique. This is a much more thorough technique. So I talked about, that's the technique. The previous technique is when you don't want to screw up, you just want to make a good enough decision. When you want to make the best decision, a really great decision, you need to use a much more thorough process. It'll take at least an hour, sometimes more, depending on the kind of decision that you want to make. And there are 8 steps in this decision. First of all, you want to identify the need to make a decision. It can be very tempting for us to continue on our current course, especially when there's no explicit problem, and not realize that, hey, it's really time to make a decision. For example, when it's time to switch from your existing database to a new one that's kind of much more complex, off-the-shelf database, or maybe your approach to getting serving clients is not working very well, or perhaps your team has ongoing conflicts and you're reluctant to address them. Those are issues when there's no explicit problem that immediately is kind of a fight or flight issue, but you need to realize that you need to make a change. Or when our instincts make it uncomfortable for us to accept the need to make a tough decision, like let's say that our relationship with a colleague is not working really well and we need to seriously address this. It can be very uncomfortable in those socially awkward situations. So you want to recognize the need before it becomes a true emergency. Next, gather information from diverse perspectives, different people who are different than you. If you're like Grace, an inveterate optimist, and like me, I'm also an inveterate optimist, you want to go toward pessimists. If you're a pessimist, you want to go toward optimists, and so on. So you look for people with different perspectives, different beliefs than you, and you place higher value on their information, who you don't necessarily need to agree with them, but place higher value on them than your gut tells you, than you intuitively feel is right. They can help you recognize your potential bias blind spots. Next, set specific and clear goals. What do you want to achieve? What is the outcome? What is your vision of the ideal outcome? Paint that clear vision. You want to especially see when a seemingly one-time issue, for example, conflict with a coworker or ongoing tensions in the team, or something going wrong continuously in the database, is a symptom of an underlying root cause. With your processes, with your systems, with your relationships, communication, make sure to address them, root problems, as part of the desired outcome. So for example, one of the people who, when we were sharing about the overly positive evaluation, says that there are too many overly positive evaluations happening over time because there aren't sufficiently objective, they're very subjective evaluation goals and measures. That's a systemic issue, and you need to address that systemic issue first before addressing any one specific to positive evaluation. Next, develop clear decision-making criteria. What would cause you to decide one way or other? What will you use to weigh the various options that you're considering as part of your decision? And then rank them. How important is each criteria for the decision-making process? Then generate viable options. You want at least 5 viable options. This is one of the biggest problems in overconfidence. And when we don't generate enough options, we just go for the first available option that seems attractive. You want to generate at least 5 viable options in order to make a seriously important decision. Then evaluate these options, picking the best of the bunch, ranking them on the criteria. So you have certain criteria and you have options, rank them on each of the criteria, multiply the rank by the weight assigned to each criteria to get a clear numerical score. You want to be aware of going with your initial preferences, what you initially feel is right. When you want to assign these ranks, look at your preferences in a more harsh light. Then you implement the option you chose, and there are 2 parts to the implementation. Imagine the decision completely failed and imagine it absolutely succeeded, to address all the problems and opportunities. So the decision failed. It's kind of like the question number 4 previously, but a more complex version of it. Brainstorm problems that might have led to this failure. So imagine it completely failed, absolutely failed. Give yourself permission to brainstorm problems that led to this failure and consider how you might solve these problems. And then integrate the solutions into your implementation plan so you take care of these problems in advance, as opposed to when they rise up. And then imagine it completely succeeded. It's wonderful, it's great, it's terrific. What are all the reasons for success? Brainstorm all of them. Consider how you can bring them into life. So you don't want to say only what are the problems, but what are the opportunities and how you can bring them into life, and integrate what you learned again into the implementation plan. And finally, step 8, evaluate the implementation, revise as needed. This is about metrics. You want to create metrics that show you to what extent you're successful. Metrics of successful implementation, you want to develop those clearly and evaluate at various stages the implementation. Check in regularly to make sure you're meeting them, and you can revise the implementation as needed, going back to any of the previous steps. So revising the original decision. I'll be happy to take questions on this. Any questions that you might have about this method. While you're thinking about the question, any questions, I want to launch another poll about how helpful might it be for some or all in your team to use the making the best decision technique for major decisions. So using this technique, how helpful might it be for folks to use this technique? And again, chat any questions that you want while we're going forward. So Rick asks if step 7 is a pilot. That's one way you can get information, but it's not actually, you're not actually doing a pilot. You're thinking about in your mind as a thought experiment about all the ways it can fail in advance and all the ways it can succeed in advance. So you can integrate them into the implementation plan. And one of the steps that you can do, of course, is launch a pilot and see what are the ways that it can fail and what are the ways it can succeed. But you don't need to do that. You can just do a thought experiment. And that can be very helpful itself. So this was definitely helpful. About just over a third of you would find it, everyone would find it helpful. Over a third of you would find it moderately helpful, and just under 2/3 would find it very helpful. Glad to hear it. Excellent. And Roger says reviewing status frequently is critical to keeping on course and confirming, revising decisions. Yes, that's 8. So you want to have clear metrics as part of reviewing the status, seeing those metrics and seeing whether you're in target, whether they need to revise things. The next thing, this was the end of all the techniques that I want to share. And this one is about the resources that I promised to send for everyone who wants them. You can have a coaching session with me to discuss this. This is a free coaching session. So just discussing these methods, how to integrate them into your organization. Decision aid on 5 key questions to avoid decision disasters. The manual on the technique for making the best decisions, and the assessment on dangerous judgment errors in the workplace. And finally, the digital copy of my best-selling book on which all of this is based. Never Go With Your Gut, How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters. So I know some of you might have already indicated that you wanted these earlier when you're signing up. You can indicate right now, or others can indicate right now, whether you'd like to opt in into getting these webinar resources from me by email. So please go ahead and vote. Great. Okay, so yeah, so we see of over a third, yes, so 70% of you would want resources and 30% of you would not. Great, so 70%, and also people who register in advance, you also get the resources. Rick asks whether I disagree with the results in Blink. Absolutely. Malcolm Gladwell's Blink is not really based on current research on neuroscience research. The Blink is not a good guide to use. So that's really very problematic stuff. Don't trust the results in Blink. It's really not using effective research. Grace says that she likes the Making the Best Decisions list, and that's helpful. I'm glad to hear it. So I'm glad that that's been helpful for you. Good. I'm glad that Roger has found the material helpful. So any questions, any comments, I'll be glad to hear them. So chat them into the chat box. I'll be happy to answer. All right. Looks like no questions. And thank you very much for attending. I hope you found this useful.
Thank you very much for speaking to us this evening. I appreciated the material. Hopefully our audience here enjoyed it. I really like the way you presented it on the screen, where we got to see you and your slides at the same time rather than bouncing back and forth between screen share and speaker view. I have to learn how you did this. It's pretty cool.
Oh, I'm using a software called Prezi Video. So Prezi, there's the presentation software. They have a new software that they come up with called Prezi Video. So if you just Google Prezi Video, you'll see the software, and I'm one of the beta testers for them.
Awesome format. So thank you so much for spending your time with us this evening. And
thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
It was great information. Really enjoyed it.
Excellent. I'm so glad that it was
Very,
helpful.
very stimulating.